forms of impurity, very low level, lasting for 24 hours. More serious impurity, like for example menstruation, might last for 7 days, but fixed up with washing. Notice that both of these can be removed by simple act of washing. But at the end of the scale, there is the worst forms of impurity, and they are very illuminating and significant. They carry very severe penalties. The penalty of excommunication and or death. Excommunication, cutting off from the people of God, cutting off from the congregation. In some cases, it's required human beings to cut off, but usually it's God who cuts the person off from his people, which is spiritual death. And the worst of all are those that carry the death penalty. Now, in most of these cases, if you look at the practicalities, and if you go to the Mishnah which discusses the practicalities, all of these are fairly hard to enforce if you translate it into civic law and in the death penalty. So the death penalty to some extent is symbolic, because what it indicates, those things that carry the death penalty are those things in which we commit spiritual suicide. Now they are suicidal activities, life-destroying activities, not just physically but spiritually. Look at the worst forms of impurity and see if you can work out some connection between them. And you'll find them in Leviticus 18 and 20. First of all, the sacrifice of children to Moloch. Now Moloch was one of the gods of the underworld, a monster, and he required his devotees to sacrifice their firstborn sons to him. Now why would they sacrifice their sons to him? What claim did Moloch have on them? We don't know a huge amount about it, but scholars have, and I think with good reason, speculated that the thinking is the following: life comes from where? The earth. And if Moloch is the main god down there, therefore life belongs to him. And not only human life comes from the earth, but crops, all agricultural life depends on the earth and comes from the earth and returns to the earth. Right? If that's the case, then why would people do what is most abhorrent, which is to sacrifice their own children to him? Some of you are parents, you have children. You can imagine how terrible it would be to sacrifice your son or your daughter to Moloch. Why would they do it?
So they get more children.
Yep. Okay, so you get more children. You sacrifice one child in order to get not only many children, but because it's the best sacrifice of all, it means that your animals are going to prosper, your plants will prosper, you will prosper on the land. Now, that's forbidden, and that's forbidden on the penalty of death. What would be the modern equivalent to that? Abortion. And take note too that most people take abortion for what are basically economic reasons. Hideous modern practice. Now we abhor this, and each age, each society has its own spiritual and moral blind spots. Abortion is one of them. Then there's consulting mediums and spiritists. Any person who conjures up some other spirit, whether it's the spirit of an ancestor, the spirit of the dead, any spiritual powers, any medium between the spiritual world and the material world is to be put to death. Now, the result of this was that if you came from the surrounding countries around Israel, there's something that would strike you straight away. Say if you go to India, you can't go down any street without being surrounded by and astrological signs and so on. Everywhere in the ancient world you had people were interested in the occult realm. You come to Israel and it's totally absent. And it's absent in its most obvious form, which is dealing with mediums and spiritists. Okay? They are to be put to death. You remember the story of Saul and the witch of Endor? Early on in his realm, he actually tried to enforce this law, which is that all medium spiritists were to be put to death. They were not to be tolerated in the Holy Land of Israel. This was one practitioner that escaped his net and was obviously protected by her community. Cursing of parents. Now, by cursing parents, the Old Testament doesn't mean losing your temper and swearing at them. Now, we tend to see cursing as swearing. We say, you so-and-so, swearing, abusing them. This is not verbal abuse in itself, but it is one very special verbal abuse. Do you know what cursing at parents means? No, it's not. It's just disrespect. It's worse than that, yes?
Would it be like in the prodigal son where he cursed his parent, basically wishing he was dead so he could inherit it?
No, he just merely acted as if his father was dead. But you're on the right track. He didn't curse his parents. He just went his own way. Acted as if his father didn't count, as if his father was dead. Now, cursing parents is doing something with this. What you do? No. Condemn in what sense? You wish them what? Dead and damned. Right? You speak them dead. You wish them dead. You take an oath saying, God strike you dead, kind of thing. Now, that's cursing parents. So it's not swearing at parents, it's not being angry at parents, but speaking your parents dead. And then there are 3 sexual abuses that are very severe forms of impurity. Adultery. Now that's a bit of a surprise. Incest, I don't think we'd have much problem with that in our modern society, but there are many societies that have problems with that. Incestuous relationships, big problem in traditional societies in ancient Israel where you have very close communities and you don't marry outside your own community and you live close together. Incest and sodomy, and it's particularly one man lying with a woman, so it's what we would call anal intercourse. Sodomy in the sense of anal intercourse. Now, all of those things are the worst forms of impurity. Added to that, and it doesn't need to be here because it's already dealt with, but you'll find this in the prophets and elsewhere in the Old Testament, is idolatry, is an absolute form of, and worship of other gods, a source of impurity. Okay, run that profile together. What sense do you make of it? Is there anything that connects them? Yep. What did you say? Well, yeah, roughly speaking, it's 10 commandments. This one has to do with murder. This one has to do with which commandment? The first, second commandment. Didn't you take it? This one's 4th commandment. This one's 6th commandment. Okay, so notice that it's very closely connected with the 10 commandments. That's very important. They all have to do with the question of life and death. They all have to do with life and the preserving of life in its fullest sense. They all have to do with death, in the sense of life in the sense of death. Any questions on those? Okay, let's see if you've got it. Of those, which is the worst of these? morally speaking, we would say, from our modern point of view, this one, no, this is good in our society. This is a preferred option. And this one, particularly here in North America and Australia, good, yes, it's recommended. This one would say, yeah, that's weird read. That's really bad. They're the creeps, the bottom of the heap. So, yeah, this is... Yeah. We would abhor this. I think you wouldn't have any argument, even in North America, that this is a good thing. There would be people who would say there's increasing lobby for sanctioning incest, as there is an increasing lobby for sanctioning paedophilia, which has got to come if the logic goes that way. But with the Old Testament, which is the most terrible of all these? That one. Why? It's not just idolatry, it's a particular form of idolatry in terms of this. It has to do with the occult. And the occult is the place, the source of impurity. This most directly, brings impurity into a person and into a community. This is the source of the worst forms of defilement, and you can work that way. Now I saw a hand up somewhere. Yes, Richard.
What does it mean to be cut off from the people? Does that mean you're headed for hell?
No.
Or they're put out of the camp, that comes up too. They're put outside the camp. Does that mean you're going to hell, or what does it?
There's three forms of being cut off. First of all, this being cut off by human beings means excommunicated from the congregation. And it's very similar to our excommunication. And that then also entails shunning within the community. Like Mennonites shunning, or Amish shunning. So that's when they are, sometimes it says you are to cut them off. That means excommunicate. When the second form is that sometimes he says this person will be cut off, that person shall be put to death. And in that case, it's not only are they excommunicated, but they are put to death by the community. Then there is some cases in which God says, I will cut them off. And that's always associated with him putting them to death. So no human agency is involved, and it doesn't say immediately on the long run. It's just that he not only casts them away from his presence, but by being cast away from his presence, quite logically, you are cut off from the source of life, which is God, therefore you die. So it doesn't have to do with salvation or damnation in the ultimate sense. It has to do with this worldly, what God does in this life, not in the life to come.
John?
Yep.
Could it be also sacrifice of children to Molech and the Kleinig god Mos? Could it be also part of it that the people were afraid to die? And
yes.
So that you sacrifice to Molech, or you worship Molech to keep them settled, so that the future would be not like maybe some kind of damnation, but that in the next life you would have some kind of happiness. If people have that inbuilt afraid to die kind of
Yes. I don't think it was so much the next life, but there would have been some of that, but that you'd have a longer, better life now. So there's stories in the ancient world of people, being threatened with death, and therefore they sacrifice an animal, or they sacrifice their children, so that to promote their own life, so that they live longer. Yeah, that comes. All that's covered by the word prosperity. Yeah? One very interesting dimension on the teaching of impurity in the Old Testament is its environmental impact. That impurity spreads. Now, to lead up to this, I want to just explain two things. First of all, evil deeds, like let's say sexual intercourse, illegal sexual intercourse. Let's take a case of rape, concretely, because it's a good example, it illustrates it very well. If a man rapes a woman, without her consent, so it's not just adultery, but it's rape. That act of rape doesn't just pollute the sinner, the rapist, but it also pollutes the person who is raped. So impurity is incurred not just by for the evildoer, but also by the people that suffer the effects of the evil deed. So if a murder is committed in a community, the murderer is quite obviously polluted. But that act of murder pollutes the whole community. It affects the whole community, it pollutes the whole community. That's the first thing. Can I just do a bit of an aside here, because I won't have a chance to deal with it elsewhere. It seems to me that one of the blind spots in pastoral care in our churches in Australia and America is that we have resources to help and to minister to people who sin, in terms of confession and absolution, but we are rather helpless in helping people who have been sinned against. How many of you have had to deal with people who've been abused, whether it's abused by parents, physically, verbally, sexually abused people, or any other form of abuse? Hands up. Only so few. I would suspect that there's many cases in your congregations of this that you're not aware of. I would say that in my ministry, for every one case that I've had of dealing with a person who sinned and therefore confession and absolution, I would have had 5 cases of people who've been abused. Abuse is a spiritual problem because abuse pollutes a person, shames them, makes them unclean. And of all the forms of abuse by parents or people in authority and sexual abuse are the worst. You need to minister to not only people who have sinned, but you also need to preach and teach and minister to people who've been abused. And you can use the 10 Commandments not only to diagnose the problem of guilt, but also the problem of shame and abuse. So for each one of those commandments, which deals with the sin, there's also the reverse side of it, which is the abuse side. And we need to use our resources that we have to deal with that. That's just an aside that I want to alert you to. It's far too big a topic for me to pursue. And if you get a chance somewhere, talk to each other or put it on the agenda of your wing calls.
Usually why those things probably happen.
Yes. Yes, because the worst form of abuse is the abuse of office, and of all offices that creates most damage is spiritual offices. So, say for example, the worst possible abuse that I could perpetrate is one that violates not just the moral order, but violates my office as a pastor and as a father. Say if I sexually abuse my daughter, I'm not only violating my office as father, but I'm also violating my office as pastor, spiritually. And that does lasting, permanent spiritual damage to that person. And abuse opens the door to the occult. Can I just throw that in? Because it's one of the keys to ministering to people caught up in the occult. Abuse, more than guilt, Guilt is one of the doors, but that's less direct. There's quite a complicated stage. But abuse, and particularly abuse of authority and sexual abuse, opens the door to the occult. And the reason we've got such a plague of occult in our society is because of this problem of abuse in these two areas. So take notice that sin affects not only the evildoer, but also the victim. And you need to, both the evildoer and the victim need to be cleansed. It's not just a matter of forgiveness of the sinner, but also the cleansing of the person who's being sinned against. And atonement in the Old Testament covers both of those sides. And atonement in the New Testament and the blood of Jesus covers both of those sides. In your liturgy, you still retain a very important word in the words of institution. You say the words of Jesus, take and drink. This is the blood of the new covenant which is shed for what? The remission of sins. Now, remission means release from sins. And I like that word, and it's right. It's aphiasis in Greek. It's not only to release people from the sins that they've committed, but also to release people from the sins that have been committed against them. The Lord's Supper is one of our, and the blood of Jesus in the Lord's Supper is one of our most important resources for ministering to people who have been abused and therefore polluted through abuse. That's just a little aside. Big topic. But it's little spoken about, and I've found since discovering this that it's been an immense help for me in my ministry. Going back to where I was here before. So sin pollutes people, the evildoer and the people who've been sinned against, and the society of the evildoer. But it goes beyond that. Certain kinds of sin and evil-doing pollute the land. To put it in modern terms, it has environmental impact. It impacts on the environment. It's interesting how the ecological movement, I'm getting tired. Scientists, and particularly people working in biology, have known for years and years that human beings were doing damage to the web of life by the way we were treating our environment. And basically, they were not getting anywhere in communicating this to the public. They hit the wall and just couldn't, the scientific findings and insights, basically they were not able to be communicated to the community at large. Until they began to speak about, and I don't know who was the first person to do so, but until they began to speak about environmental disorder and abuse in terms of, what word? Pollution. As soon as they used that word, it solved itself. Powerfully. And it's one of the central key concepts now of our modern way of thinking. Environmental pollution. What we do pollutes disorders, or disorder pollutes, makes unclean, pollutes the environment. Do you realise that in fact it's a very crude metaphor, it's only a metaphor, that in fact the things we do, carbon dioxide doesn't pollute the environment, it disorders the environment but it doesn't pollute it. Think it through. It's a metaphor, but it's such a powerful metaphor that it sells itself. Now, here in the Old Testament, there are three kinds of impurity that pollute the land, that go beyond the social order. That's sexual impurity, these here, child sacrifice, and murder. Yes?
Do you think that if the same kind of direction was taken with regards to sexual immorality, the whole homosexual agenda, and so on and so forth, that it was more labeled as a pollution of the society, that it might have a gain of ear and turn its course by just calling it sexually immoral or immoral when everybody says morality is individual.
Yes. In fact, that's the way people used to talk about it. And one of the big liberation agendas is to get rid of that language. There were two things. It was unclean, dirty, polluted, and it's perverse. Perversity was the old thing, which is an order word. It twists order, disorders. So the old understanding, and this is not just Christian but general, that homosexuality is a disorder, and homosexuality pollutes. It's an act of self-pollution. And a large measure, it's interesting to trace the selling of homosexuality in your society and in my society, how the strategy that's being used to train, it's very, very clever. And you need to be familiar with it to turn it around. But if you really wanted to put the wind up them, you just go out and say, it's an act of self-pollution, or it's suicidal. Which you could argue for very, very closely given the AIDS epidemic.
Not just AIDS.
And that's just the tip of a whole lot of other things. Yeah. Right. Now, I've said that I've spoken to you about Mary Douglas, who says that purity and impurity are universal categories. And on the surface, if you come from traditional societies, pagan societies to the Old Testament, it looks very, very similar, just on the first reading, until you go to the detail, and then you see that even though the same terms are being used, they are used quite differently. Now, purity and impurity everywhere in the world are used basically as physical and social categories. Let me explain the way it works traditionally, and then I want to go to this. What's clean is what has to do with my healthy body. Pollution comes from outside my body into my body. So the most obvious sources of impurity are that which comes in me through my mouth. And if I'm a woman, through my vagina, through my ears, maybe, but the obvious place of pollution is through the mouth, the hands which bring something to the mouth. So pollution is what comes from outside. Disorder is out there, the body is ordered, and so ideas of clean and unclean have to do with embodiment, living within the body. And this is extended then to, it's not just has to do with my body, but it has to do with my family and my house. So I keep my body clean, even though stuff out there is dirty. That's disordered, but I order this. I wash my clothes, I wash my body, cut my hair. I clean my house, but I don't clean the street. Or I don't clean the stuff out there. And then it's carried on from, me, my family, my people, my race are the clean people. Who are the unclean people? Everybody else. The others are unclean. And so I've got to protect myself from them because they are the unclean people. So in all societies, clean and unclean is basically a physical, social term. Have you got it? Because that's so common, you can illustrate it in many different ways. You see it in its most clearly articulated way in Hindu society of India, where it's basically determined by classes of people. You know the castes of people? You have the Brahmins, who are the pure. Brahmin means the pure ones. They are the most clean ones. They're at the top of the society. They are the spiritual people. And then you have various castes going down. It's all very carefully ordered. And at the bottom you have the untouchables. They are unclean. No Brahmin would be seen dead with a untouchable. I saw it when I was in India. Now they're coming down the street, and untouchables coming here. What do? They go the other side of the street. They take care. When they're coming, if they've got to go close, they do a wide circuit around them. They make sure that the shadow doesn't even fall on them. And so you go into clean and unclean is a class thing. Now, as soon as you come to the Old Testament, right from the beginning in Leviticus, clean and unclean works in a completely different way. Because the basic premise is that all human beings are what? Unclean. And there's only one source of purity, and that's God. And that means even the most holy Israelites, the high priest and the priests, require constant purification. If they require purification, what does it mean? They're unclean. So, clean and unclean ceases to be a social, physical category, and it becomes a liturgical category. Do you understand what I mean by liturgical category? It has to do with relationship with God, not relationship with other people. And so, since God created all human beings, and all human beings are descendants from Adam, no human beings are more or less inherently clean or unclean. Now they're all in the same boat. All Israelites are unclean, and impurity is not because you're born into a particular family or caste, but comes as a result of sin and the environment that has been created by sin, the fallen world. In a fallen world, all human beings are unclean. When it comes to cleansing, purification, if you have a minor form of impurity, you deal with it by washing. And then strangely, major forms of impurity are dealt with by the use of blood. And this is where the whole enactment of atonement comes in. So I won't deal with it at great length now. Just saying that cleansing comes through the use of blood. God reserves blood to be used for atonement. Atonement has to do with cleansing. Cleansing not only from guilt for sinners, but also cleansing from the stain of being sinned against. The rules for purity and impurity have to do with admission to God's presence. So, clean and unclean is not used to put people into particular groups within society or to create a hierarchy of people, good people, bad people, but it has to do with access to God's presence, safe access to God's presence. And I say safe access to God's presence because if I, as an unclean person, come into the presence of God, then I desecrate God's holiness, and the judgment of God, the wrath of God, comes on me. This helps to explain what is a strange phenomenon. I would have expected, the Kleinig principle again, that lay people would be the people that would require the most stringent forms of purification. Why? Because they're out there in the world. Do you know which people require the most stringent forms of purification? Priests. And of all the priests, which one requires the most purification? High priest. And why is that so?
He comes into the presence of God.
Because he comes into the presence of God. Petrol is not dangerous unless it comes in the presence of fire. Impurity is no big issue until it comes into the presence of God. They're holy. So the rules for impurity and purity have to do with admission to God's presence, and they have to do with inclusion or exclusion from the holy congregation. and they have to do with the maintenance of holy status. Okay, you start off with the premise that every Israelite is holy, every Israelite shares in God's holiness. If that's so, then what is the basic imperative in the life of every Israelite is to maintain, preserve their holiness. What is it that attacks, diminishes, destroys holiness? Impurity. So impurity the purification and the rules of purity have to do with the preservation of holiness, the maintenance of holiness. Let's see, how's time going? Do we need to have a break now, or shall I finish this in the background? You can still go for 10 minutes? Okay. If I fall asleep, somebody wake me up. Now, one of the good things about the whole theology of purity and holiness is that it integrates everything. It integrates the physical with the mental and the emotional and the spiritual. But its basic modality is physical. In the Old Testament, it's physical in the way it works, even though it involves spiritual things. So the purity and the rules of purity connect your physical life, your bodily life, with the divine service. It connects the tabernacle with the home and the home with the tabernacle. The rules for purity apply equally in the bedroom as at the banquet table at the temple. They apply to the holy meals at the temple as well as the daily meals in the home, connecting temple and home together. It connects God's presence, God's blessings, which are given at the temple, with the bedroom, procreation, having children. So it links worship and life together, the divine service with daily work. Clean and unclean, the rules of purity bring those things which always fall apart so easy, bring them closely together. Now, what's the reason that God demands purity from the Israelites, but he doesn't require the same standards of purity for pagan people? They don't have access to his holiness, therefore it's not relevant for them. So the demand for purity comes from the Lord's presence with his people. And the highest demands for purity come from those who are closest to the Lord. To turn it around the other way, God's aim is to once again sanctify and consecrate the whole of his creation. You remember in Genesis 1 and 2, or Genesis 2 largely, God created the world and he created a garden. And it was a strange garden because that garden is the first church, the first sanctuary. It's a holy place. It's a holy place. I won't go into all the stuff there, but all the symbolism there of the garden indicates it's a holy place. It's a holy place where God walks and talks with human beings, and they live in God's presence. And there's harmony, there's order, there's holiness there. Okay? As a result of sin, what happens? They're cast outside the garden. They're expelled. They live the life east of Eden, and impurity pervades the whole of God's creation. Now, what is the aim of God, beginning with Abraham and leading them to Mount Sinai and the laws of Moses, the institution of the divine service, culminating in the incarnation, the death and resurrection of Christ, and the establishment of the church? His aim is to once again re-sanctify, reconsecrate the whole of his creation. He's not just into saving souls or saving the Israelites. He's into sanctifying, re-sanctifying the whole of his creation. And in his plan then, the establishment of the tabernacle and the sanctuary is God establishing a bridgehead, a holy bridgehead here in his creation from which he can then radiate holiness and purity out into the world. So there's two things that he wants to do, is to cleanse what is unclean and to sanctify what is common in creation. That's his aim. And that comes to its fulfillment in the incarnation of Christ. Let me just give you an analogy of this. About 30 years ago now, gosh, I'm getting old. 30 years ago, I was living up in Brisbane. That's a big city on the north part of the east coast of Australia. And while I was there, at summertime, we had the worst flood that they had in living memory. The Brisbane River flooded. It was just a cyclone came from the sea and dumped inches and inches of rain over the headwaters of the Brisbane River, and it flooded something like a quarter of Brisbane. And after the floodwaters had receded, I worked together with another friend of mine to clean out the house of people who were our friends. They were so traumatized by the whole business that they just couldn't do anything. I'll never forget when I first set foot into that house that had the floodwaters up to this high in the ceiling. Now it's river mud, and the river mud's terrible because it's oily, greasy, stinky stuff. And it's very, very hard to move and shift. Now I remember opening the door and coming into that house and just standing there. Where do I begin to cleanse a house that has been totally polluted with this awful, stinking river mud? So we did, this friend of mine and I reconnoitred the house, and we looked and we thought the obvious place would be to start at the core. But once we worked out the practicalities of it, it doesn't work, because how do you move the dirt? What you need to have to move dirt, this kind of dirt, the only thing that removes it is water. But you not only need a supply of water, but you need a way of disposing that mud. So to do two things, you've got to get rid of the impurity, and you've got to clean everything. We started off in the bathroom. Can you work out with the bathroom? And can you work out which two places we would have started with? There was a bathtub. My friend started off with the bathtub, and I started off with the wash basin. And if there would have been a third person, he would have started off in the toilet. The water supply was still there, and I still remember then starting off. I was there with the wash basin. It was totally polluted. Turning on the tap, getting a rag, and just cleaning that, and then using the wash basin to, you did the wall and above. You started off creating that, and you'd wash it down, and then you wash the rag, and then you go back, wash, get the dirt, wash it off, start it again. And any object you bring into the wash basin, fill it with water, and you'd have to put it in a clean place, because otherwise it gets dirty again. And so from that little bridgehead, we worked out, and in the space of 3 days, cleaned out the whole of the house. Now, that's an analogy of what I see God doing in the tabernacle, the temple. God establishes a holy, clean bridgehead to get rid of the filth from his creation, and to radiate purity, to purify his creation. Now what he starts off with in the tabernacle and temple is completed in the new temple, who's Jesus and his sacrificial death and resurrection. So the sanctuary is a holy bridgehead, a foothold that God establishes here in a fallen world, and its intention is to reach out into the whole of his creation and cleanse it all. And if you think in these terms then, the basic duty of the Israelites and the priest is to do guard duty. Now this is a term that you won't find translated accurately in hardly any of the current modern English translations. The Hebrew is shamar, which is keep or guard or protect, and then you get the noun from that, which is mishmerah. I'll have to create a bit more space for myself. Now, mishmerah is the noun from shamar, and it's the term, I won't go into the whole etymology and stuff, but basically it means to do guard duty. Now, there's two reasons why you do guard duty. So, for example, a city has its city guards, its watchmen. That would be the shomerim from that. The shamar, the participle shomer. So the city watchmen are the shomerim, the guards. Now, what do the guards do for the city? They to protect the city from being attacked from outside by the enemy. And likewise, every king has his bodyguards. What does the king do then? Why does he have bodyguards? To protect his enemies from attacking him. Now, that's the word that's used for the Israelites in connection with their religious duty. Let's have a look at two passages and let's see if you can work out in what way they do guard duty. First of all, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 30. This is the end of the chapter on sexual impurity. Let's start off with the front here. Leviticus 18, verse 30. I can't read. Yes. Charles, would you read that?
Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God.
Literally in Hebrew it says, do guard duty. That's what's translated rather vaguely as keep my requirements. Do guard duty, and do not follow any of the detestable practices or customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. Notice if you go just before that, it's talking about defiling the land and defiling yourselves. So you do guard duty for the land and for the people in the land. Let's go to the second passage, which talks about priests doing guard duty. Leviticus chapter 8, verse 35. Namichi, could you read, please? 8, verse 35. Oh, brother, you got it, don't you? Have you got it on the meeting? Yes. Leviticus 8, verse...
You must stay at the entrance to the tent of meeting, day and night for 7 days, and do what they will require, so you will not die. For that is what I have been commanded.
Now this is talking about the priests for the week in which they are consecrated. He says that they are to stay at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and they are to do guard duty. Do what the Lord requires. So you stay in the entrance and you do guard duty. Just to envisage it. Okay. For that week in which they undergo purification, they are to do guard duty here at the entrance to the tent of meeting. This area here. do guard duty. What on earth's going on here? What's meant by doing guard duty? So they are to do guard duty. The lay people are to do guard duty for the land and their families in the land, and the priests are to do guard duty at the temple. Can any of you work out the reason for it?
Well, you have to protect any defilement from coming in inside the temple.
Okay, now why is it, let's go here, why is it that the priests prevent people coming in and defiling God's holiness? Is it to protect God?
No.
It's to protect the people.
The source of the holiness.
The source of the holiness is protected, but also the people are protected so that they are kept safe from being damaged, endangered, dying. So the duty of the priest is to do guard duty at the temple, preventing defilement and desecration. But notice that what the priests do at the holy sanctuary, the people do for the land. How does it work as far as the land's concerned? They are to stop what happening? Impurity coming into the land and defiling and desecrating the land. Doing guard duty. Yes.
So is that what the apostles are to do when Jesus sent them out? Baptizing and teaching all nations. And the Greek word is to guard or keep.
Shema, now that's to observe. But there is a very important application of this in the New Testament. You know that very famous passage in Ephesians chapter 6 about spiritual warfare? We are not called to go out and attack Satan and the powers of darkness to conquer the world for God, but what are we required to do? To stand. And the term stand there is the term for doing sentry duty. We do sentry duty, and we do sentry duty on behalf of the people of God, for the saints. We protect holy ground. And how do we do sentry duty, protecting holy ground? Holy ground is the church, the people of God. We do holy guard duty by interceding for the people of God. So by prayer and intercession, we do guard duty for the holy place and the holy people of God. That's the New Testament application. And this is also carried over into the ministry. Let's see its application to the ministry. Can you turn to Hebrews chapter 13? Verse 17 and 18. No, we'll just take verse 17, that will do. Could you read it, please? Where are we? Yes. What's your name?
Jeff.
Yeah. Could you read it, please?
Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you.
Notice the second sentence. They, your leaders, pastors, keep watch, not over you. The Hebrew has, they keep watch on, not the Hebrew, the Greek says, they keep watch on behalf of you, as those who must give an account for your souls. So you as pastors are called to do sentry duty, keeping watch on behalf of your people. How do you keep watch on behalf of your people? By praying for them. You protect them from defilement, and you protect the holy place, the church of God, from desecration. Yes?
You can also do it by adhering to sound doctrine. You have to be very careful you're not hearing your doctrine when you preach.
Yes. That's what I would have expected this to be, but the doing guard duty is not so much, that image is not used to guard the doctrine, but it has to do with the New Testament intercessory prayer. Very interesting. I just partly time it all together. The whole theology of clean and unclean has to do with worship in the Old Testament. They are liturgical categories. Ritual impurity, ritual purity. So it has to do with worship. And it has to do with safe access to the presence of God and receiving the blessings of God. What these terms do is emphasize the importance of the body in worship and place in worship. You see, we don't worship sort of in a modern sense in some cyberspace, which is no space, mental space, but we serve God with our bodies. Remember what Paul says in Romans 12? Beseech you then, on behalf of the mercies of God, present your bodies as living sacrifices. This is your acceptable service. Both Old Testament, New Testament, the body is important in worship. And clean and unclean has to do with the involvement of our bodies in worship. And our bodies are never discarded bodies, they are always in one location, and so location also is important in worship. One of the very strong influences of modern theology is to think in terms, to cast our theology and our worship entirely in terms of personal relationships. And there's an element of truth. What is God interested in? Is right relationships with himself, each other. You know the basic story. That gets hammered in almost every single textbook of theology that you care to buy and read. But that's only part of the truth. God's not only interested in relationships, he's interested in bodies. And what we do with our bodies and where our bodies are. And that brings in the whole question of purity and impurity. Let's take